Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I think that more or less cover all the time zones of those of you who are joining us for this webinar. My name is Mariki Olofsson. I'm the project manager for the Ubuntu Dialogues project at Stellenbosch University at the museum. And joining me on the Zoom screen, how our lives have changed, is Dr. Allison Geduld, who is one of 9 Ubuntu Dialogue Exchange Fellows for 2021, and Professor Rosalind Dixon of the Law Faculty at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. And she generously agreed to respond and engage with Allison's work today. I want to welcome you to this event, Ubuntu, Decolonisation and South African Law. On behalf of my counterpart at Michigan State University, Dr. Upenyu Maji, and the principal investigators on the project, Professor Jamie Monson at Michigan State and Mr. Bongani Mgijima at Stellenbosch University. This webinar is the 4th in this year's exchanges, featuring Ubuntu Dialogue Exchange Fellows from Stellenbosch University and Michigan State University. For those of you who are not familiar with the project, just a brief description. The Ubuntu Dialogues project is an international exchange program between Michigan State in the United States and Stellenbosch University in South Africa. The lead department at Michigan State is the African Studies Center, and at Stellenbosch University, the project is hosted by the Stellenbosch University Museum. The seminar exchange program is one of 3 components of the project. Apart from the seminar exchanges, the Ubuntu Dialogue project also involves a student graduate fellowship, a series of conversations between students from Stellenbosch and Michigan State, and practitioners working in the museum and archive spaces in the United States and in South Africa. More information about the project and the seminars and webinars hosted between 2019 and today is available on the website. The information of the website will be posted in the chat file. South Africa's constitution has ambitious aspirations. Its preamble states that this supreme law of the Republic was adopted to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. To lay the foundations for a democratic and open society in which government is based on the will of the people and every citizen is equally protected by the law. To improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person, and to build a united and democratic South Africa able to take its rightful place as a sovereign state in the family of nations. These aspirations speak to me and millions of fellow citizens who are not lawyers or advocates or constitutional law experts, because it says something about who we are and who we could be in relation to one another. The Constitution is not a cold, objective legal instrument. It evokes emotions. And as citizens, we argue about its meaning and about its application, and learning about its effect on our lives is ongoing. Today's webinar is part of that learning, and we, as the Ubuntu Dialogues project, are proud to facilitate this conversation between one of our 2021 seminar exchange fellows, Dr. Allison Geduld, and her respondent, Professor Rosalind Dixon, from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. An important aim of the Ubuntu Dialogues project is to generate transcontinental conversations about the meaning and application of Ubuntu. In expanding the conversation about this seemingly simple but also immensely complex concept over national and cultural borders, we are hoping to contribute to a broader conversation about how we relate to one another, not just in our communities and in our countries, but also as citizens in the world. as members of states, but in a family of nations, as the preamble to our Constitution puts it. We do hope that you will join the conversation in the chat file and in the question and answer session. I will now introduce Dr. Geduld and Professor Dixon, and then hand it over to Dr. Geduld. Professor Dixon will then respond, and I will return to the screen to moderate the question and answer session. Rosalind Dixon is a professor of law at University of New South Wales, Sydney, and former co-president of the International Society of Public Law. Professor Dixon's research and teaching focus on comparative constitutional law and constitutional design, constitutional democracy, theories of constitutional dialogue and amendment, socio-economic rights, and constitutional law and gender. Her current focus is on fragile democracies or the threat posed by democratic backsliding, and what law and legal institutions may be able to do about it. Professor Dixon, along with University of New South Wales economics professor Richard Holden, is leading the University of New South Wales's Grand Challenge on Inequality. She is a member of the Gilbert and Tobin Centre of Public Law and Deputy Director of the Herbert Smith Free Hills Initiative on Law and Economics. In 2018, Professor Dixon was named Academic of the Year at the 18th Annual Lawyers Weekly Australian Law Awards. Earlier this month, Professor Dixon received a grant to further her research on constitutional design and democratic resilience. This project looks at current threats to constitutional democracy globally and how principles of constitutional design could be refined to help build greater democratic resilience in the face of these threats. It considers interdisciplinary understandings of resilience and comparative constitutional experiences. Dr. Allison Geduld is a senior lecturer at the Northwest University Potchefstroom campus. She completed her LLB, BA Honours and LLM cum laude and LLD at the Northwest University. She teaches jurisprudence and ethics. Her research interests include jurisprudence, socioeconomic rights, and legal education. Dr. Geduld's thesis, Ubuntu as a Constitutional Value, a Social Justice Perspective, explored the link between Ubuntu as a constitutional value and the pursuit of social justice by the judiciary. The study found that Ubuntu as a constitutional value has the potential to bring about the realization of social justice as it places particular emphasis on marginalized and oppressed groups. Besides the role of Ubuntu as a value that promotes social justice, her current research further explores whether Ubuntu, as an African legal concept, contributes towards the decolonization of the South African law. Alison, over to you. We are looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you very much, Mariki, for the wonderful introduction. I'm very excited to be here and to talk about this topic that I've spent a few years on. I'm also very thankful for Professor Dixon, who's also here, and I can see that it's nighttime on that side of the world. Thank you very much for joining us, and everyone else that's here for taking time out of their busy schedule. So as you can see, my topic today is Ubuntu, decoloniality, and South African law. I do want to state a little disclaimer and say that I realize that these are really big topics in themselves, and we can have week-long conferences on each of them. So my talk is really aimed at stimulating conversation and also debate around the tangents of these topics and the questions that they evoke. I can see that there are a lot of people from different disciplines and also different places around the world. So I I added some slides on the South African context. So by way of introduction, I want to start by talking about the resurgence of conversations around decoloniality in South Africa. So most South African academics would remember 2015 as the year of fees must fall and roads must fall. And this was the year in which student protests really took place across South Africa, and they were they used these two hashtags: fees must fall and roads must fall, in relation to, firstly, the exorbitant tuition fees at South African universities. So there was a call to for free university education, as well as the roads must fall movement, which was about the statue of Cecil John Rhodes at the University of Cape Town. As you can see that statue there in the picture on the right-hand side, the one at the bottom. So students called for the removal of the statue, as it encapsulated and depicted really a sense of coloniality and institutional and structural racism. The thing about these protests was that it started a new conversation around inequality, racism, and coloniality at South African universities. Most definitely not the first time that there was talk about decolonization or coloniality at South African universities, but this was usually the type of words that you heard if you studied history or African studies. But there was really a new start to talk about this in disciplines also outside of the normal disciplines. So there was a call by the students also to decolonize the curriculum. And they wanted to see and study things about the world that they lived in. So this call to decolonize was no exception to the legal community. And there was indeed many discussions in the legal fraternity, as well as at many law faculties in South Africa around the decolonial turn. So on the one hand, it dealt with the curriculum, what we teach law students, but on the other hand, it also dealt with the content of South African law. If we look at the South African legal system, there is a lot that we can say in relation to decoloniality. As you would know, as Dr. Allison just mentioned, in 1996, South Africa adopted a final constitution. And on the right-hand side there, it's a bit, she also read parts of it, it's a bit small, but it's the preamble of the constitution. And this constitution envisions a society based on democratic values, social justice, and human rights. It goes on to state that the constitution is the supreme law of the country, and it is there to heal the divisions of the past and to establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental rights, to lay the foundation for the democratic and open society in which government is based on the will of the people and every citizen is equally protected by law. And also, very importantly, to improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person, and to build a united and democratic South Africa able to take its rightful place as a sovereign state in the family of nations. So there was very much at this time, if we think back to 1996, 1995, the idea of the creation of a new South Africa. And it was a South Africa that would not be defined by its racist past. It was an equal space. Difference and diversity would be embraced. And it was really couched in the terminology of a rainbow nation. And this idea of the rainbow nation was encapsulated in the African term Ubuntu. And the Ubuntu was understood to refer to a sense of reconciliation and peacemaking and creating a different society that was not based on the violence and disposition and the past that we come from. So this was the goals we wanted to create the society. Very importantly, how are we going to create this society? Well, the legal system would play a big role. Interestingly, our legal system did not change overnight. Many countries undergoing change do opt for an entirely new legal system, but we did not. So obviously, very overtly racist laws were repealed, such as the Group Areas Act, the Immorality Act, or really any of these acts that explicitly created these categories of race. So that was repealed, but it was also decided during this time of negotiation in South Africa that law would be developed over time to align with constitutional rights and values. And in our constitution, there was specifically a section 39 of the constitution that stated that courts would develop customary law and common law to gradually develop and be in line with the values of our constitution. So the idea that law would, with time, change our society to a more equal society is encapsulated in the term transformative constitutionalism. Some of you might know that this was a term coined by Carl Clare, the American legal scholar. So there really was a lot of hope and a big obligation on the courts to put into action this type of change that we wanted to see in the world. So Ubuntu has really been one of these values that courts have used to put into action transformative constitutionalism, together with many other constitutional values, including values such as human dignity, equality, freedom, and so forth. In one of the recent constitutional court cases, I read this quote, and it made me think about the specific role of Ubuntu and whether, what role has it really played in the transformation of, well, the law in South Africa and also the South African society. And I'll read this quote to you. It says the following: Western pace setters conceptualized and defined philosophy in the image of the dominant European and American thought systems, which they used as benchmarks for measuring the propriety of all philosophical thought. They by and large overlooked the very rich African philosophy and jurisprudence in its overarching feature, Ubuntu. And as a result of this history, its operation under the constitutional dispensation must be given prominence to be fully recognized and integrated. So from this quote, one can see that there's a real reliance on Ubuntu as something that would be uniquely African and that's needed in our constitutional dispensation. So so the real question is, how does Ubuntu relate to decoloniality? Could it be seen as a decolonial concept within South African law? So of course, the first question that one might be asking is, and I think that all of us were asking since 2015, was, what do we mean when we talk about decoloniality? In this sense, I think it's important to distinguish decolonization from decoloniality. And I find the following quote by Maldonado Torres useful. I'll read it as well. Coloniality is different from colonialism. Colonialism denotes a political and economic relation in which the sovereign of a nation or a people rests on the power of another nation, which makes such a nation an empire. Coloniality instead refers to long-standing patterns of power that emerge as a result of colonialism. but they define culture, labor, intersubjectivity relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administrations. Thus, coloniality survives colonialism. It is maintained alive in books, in the criteria for academic performance, in cultural patterns, in common sense, in the image of peoples, in aspirations of self, and so many other aspects of our modern experience. In a way, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. How, if we look at the situation in South Africa, first of all, one should say that we do know that South Africa was a colony, and the conquest of South Africa was part of the project of Western modernity. Interestingly, the interesting thing about South Africa in relation to the rest of Africa is that one can say that we sort of had a pseudo decolonization, depending on when you saw that decolonization, whether it was in 1910 or 1961, when we became a republic. And the reason why I say pseudo colonization is because many countries in Africa during the 60s received their independence. South Africa received independence and became a republic in 1961, but we were still in the grips of a system of apartheid. So really, it didn't change a lot in the country in terms of oppression, in terms of inequality, in terms of racist laws that were there at the time. So it was just a continuation of what was before that. It's also important to note that South Africa has had a long history of violence and dispossession, starting already 300 years ago. Within this system of violence and dispossession and colonialism and apartheid, there was a very specific idea of what it meant to be human. And really, it was tied up with Western, it was a very Western idea. And it was really the idea of being white as well. So one could only really be seen as fully human if you were seen as a white person. And in South Africa, that idea of being human has for so long been tied up with the idea of race and class. And we still see a lot of those patterns being perpetuated in South Africa. And so when we think about the protests of the students in 2015, and all of the conversations and research that has been taking place since then, the question comes up, how far have we really come as a society? Back in 1994, 1996, we wanted to be this rainbow nation, but now those questions are creeping up. How far have we really come? Are we this nation that's one, or are we just, as they say, many? And this is really the essence of decolonial critique. And so, as you might have imagined, it's kind of difficult to kick this type of oppression that's been there for more than 300 years. So I see the decolonial critique as firstly acknowledging these types of structural inequalities, that is the structural inequalities created by colonization along the lines of class and race. And then secondly, also questioning or having a critical perspective on those structures. It's important to note also that within South Africa, there's been more conversation specifically within law from a decolonial perspective. I'm going to name a few of these scholars that have been engaging very critically with the transformative constitutional project in South Africa. Tsepo Matlengosi, for example, has stated that for us to think about human rights, the only grammar of dignity is not adequate to dislodge the idea of white supremacy, institutional racism, and structural exclusion. So Nele Sebande has been very critical of the concept of transformative constitutionalism, actually stating that, asking the question, what is transformative about our constitutionalism? We call it a post-liberal constitution in the sense that it tries to do more than just your classical liberal constitution, which is there to restrict state power and secure a large number of negative freedoms. We call our constitution transformative because it has a number of characteristics that's there to create a more equal society. It has features such as the fact that it's historically conscious. It has justiciable socioeconomic rights. It speaks of multiculturalism and a number of other features. So Nele Sebande is critical of this and says that really it kind of boils down to, at the end of the day, we put this label on it, but it operates just like any other liberal constitution. Joel Madire has also been very critical of the transformative project by saying that by following a path of friendly understanding rather than dangerous understanding, the constitution making process in South Africa may have foreclosed a deep and difficult reckoning with our colonial and apartheid history, leading us on the trail of an unsustainable future. So one of the points of critique coming from Modiri has been that we have not really engaged with our history of racism, of inequality, that transformative constitutionalism or the liberal democratic constitution that we have has really kind of been colorblind, sort of whitewashing the past, and that the past is not really something that we can very easily just forget. Emil Zizka, specifically writing about the law of delict, has stated that a transformative paradigm does not necessarily equate to a decolonial paradigm. So there's been a lot of criticism about our constitutional project. So how does the decolonial critique relate to Ubuntu? So I think looking at Ubuntu, one of the things that really come out is that it is a conceptually contested term. And very often people will say, well, we don't know, we can't use the term because we don't know what it means. To my mind, I don't think the objection is so much that it cannot be specifically defined, but that the definitions almost fall on the one side to more moderate and on the other side to more radical viewpoints of Ubuntu. Some of the more moderate viewpoints would be what you would, and I will get to that just now, would be what you would find in our constitutional jurisprudence, is what you would find in the preamble of the Constitution. So it's very much about interconnectedness, humanity, considering other people, human dignity, reconciliation. It's all about creating this one society. But there is another understanding of Ubuntu that has a more radical viewpoint. And the reason why I say radical is because it cannot always be reconciled with the choices that have been made about a liberal democratic constitution years ago. And in this sense, so if you look at the pictures on the right-hand side at the bottom, there's Desmond Tutu, where's the more moderate viewpoint. And then at the top there is Magobe Ramose, who's written a considerable amount on Ubuntu from a more radical perspective. So for Ramose, on the one hand, Ubuntu relates to an African way of life. It does relate to interconnectedness, humanity, recognizing other people. But at the same time, Ubuntu is rooted in African philosophy. And when he says it's rooted in African philosophy, it means that we cannot separate Ubuntu from the whole quest for liberation of African people. And so in this sense, Ubuntu has to be seen as part and parcel of a fight against colonial movements and coloniality. So in that, as I've just stated, in the whole conquest of Africa, Black people, African people were seen as less human, and their humanity and dignity was broken down. And so part of Ubuntu is about rebuilding that sense of being a human being, of being conscious of being African, as not being inferior, of being of feeling entitled and worthy as an African person. So one could not, so according to Ramose, one could not speak about Ubuntu without speaking about the whole history of violence, dispossession, and conquest in Africa, and the fight for not just transformation, but very importantly, liberation. So it's inherently tied up with the struggle and history of Africa, and the connectedness with race and with class. So Ramose is not in favor of the type of understanding that we currently have of Ubuntu as a notion that is there to constitute a rainbow nation in just reconciliation. He questions the validity of the constitution that was negotiated. He questions the fact that that justice occurred by virtue of dispossession and the amounts of violence that we've seen in Africa and in South Africa, and that it cannot just be forgotten. And so for me, one of the things that I really struggled to get my mind around was, how do we reconcile these two different views of Ubuntu? We obviously chose the more, from a constitutional viewpoint, I think we obviously chose a more moderate viewpoint because it fits into that constitutional liberal paradigm. It would not make sense to choose a more radical viewpoint that questions the very nature and basis of the Constitution. So that is, I think, I just want to say that is, I think, one of the big questions when looking at Ubuntu. And if we look at Ubuntu and the law in South Africa, there's been a number of cases where it has been used, sometimes in the reasoning, but many times sort of as what we will call obiter dictum, as a sort of a, not forming part of the reason for the decision, but just as a sort of a side note. So one of the first cases where Ubuntu was mentioned was State versus Makonyane, which was the case that dealt with the abolishment of the death penalty in South Africa. It was also mentioned in PE municipality versus various occupiers. That case dealt with the eviction of illegal occupiers of land. AfriForum versus Malema was a case about hate speech, where Julius Malema, leader of the EFF, had sung a song about with the title "Kill the Poor." And in all of these cases, one can see that the Constitutional Court and some lower courts as well chose to go with a more moderate viewpoint and to see the Ubuntu as the sense of interconnectedness, very much like a synonym for human dignity. In PE municipality versus various occupiers, in that case, Justice Albie Sachs used the value to speak about the plight of poor South Africans in South Africa. And in AfriForum versus Malema, Ubuntu was also used as a notion that established this idea of a rainbow nation. It was actually a very good case to problematize and look at the concept of race in South Africa, but once again, it was seen as a very value neutral sort of objective idea. Okay, so what I want to say about Ubuntu as a value is that it's clear that it fits into a very liberal classical idea of rights and transformation. When I looked at Ubuntu, I was of the opinion that it does have some transformative potential when courts invoke, for example, Section 39. Why do I say this? Because as a notion that considers other people, is a notion that considers marginalized groups such as the poor, for example, as in PE municipality versus various occupiers. There's this sense of interrelatedness, and it can really highlight the duty that rests on the state towards its citizens, for example. And then very importantly, it's important to remember that human beings are socially constituted. I think the idea of human rights as a notion that guarantees negative freedom is a bit one-sided. We as people are socially constituted. We don't just want to be left alone. We actually need quite a number of things from other people, from our community, from our government, in order for us to live our lives and to realize those freedoms. So I do think that in a transformative sense, it can be used, Ubuntu can be used in the sense that it can highlight this interconnectedness, that we are not just these atomic beings on our own that don't really need anything from our societies and communities. What are the potential pitfalls of Ubuntu in the legal sphere? I think that a lot of emphasis has been placed on the courts and their role in realizing transformative constitutionalism. So it relies very heavily on judicial interpretation, and not just judicial interpretation, but a very specific idea of judicial interpretation, a very progressive idea. So it might be that a judge or the judiciary does not have perhaps a more legally conservative understanding of the law or of Ubuntu, and then these transformative ideals might not be realized. It could be used in a very acontextual, historical manner. If I think about Ubuntu, it definitely does have potential in terms of realizing transformative constitutionalism, but it's currently not used to contextualize coloniality and to speak about these types of conversations. It's very difficult, I think, to imagine a society based on choices that were not made. I think there were a number of choices that South Africa could have made. If we think about 1994, 1995. So it's difficult to imagine a different type of future. But I do think people have started to get really critical about the society that we envisioned. And even though we talk about transformative constitutionalism, it's really hard to look past the fact that a lot of people's material well-being has not really been affected. There's still massive amounts of inequality, there's still massive amounts of poverty in South Africa, and that makes us also become very critical of the whole notion of transformative constitutionalism and the possibility that it has. I just want to conclude by referring to a quote by Spivak, just one quote, and then I will end, if I can find the quote, which makes me think about the South African society, who says that rape is something about which nothing good can be said. On the other hand, if there is a child, that child cannot be ostracized because it is a child of rape. To an extent, the post-colonial is that. And perhaps this is a potential way of looking at the South African society, South African post-colonial society.
Rosalind, I'm going to ask you to respond to Allison straight away.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Allison, for such a fascinating presentation that has so much richness in it. I'm seeing in the chat how much interest it's generated, and people want to get their hands on your very careful and insightful analysis. I want to begin just by saying what a wonderful event that I think this is, and then to break down Allison's insights onto two levels. One is her claim about decoloniality, and the second is about how Ubuntu as a concept might be able to be a normative discourse for achieving a project of decoloniality, and to think about the preconditions that she highlights for us. So I just want to start by saying what a wonderful dialogue project that I think this is, and to congratulate the museums, if you like. I can see that Jim Dashett from MSU Museum is there, as well as MSU colleagues. It's really wonderful to have lawyers and educators and curators of the public imagination, the people who curate our museums, joining together in this kind of conversation. Part of a project of long-term transformation requires holding people's memory and understanding what it is that has to be overcome. And when young South Africans are too young to have experienced apartheid or to really have known about it, reminding people of what the project is and why it matters is deeply important to peace, justice, and the achievement of the Constitution's vision. And equally, I think for MSU and its African Studies Centre to be engaging in this kind of global dialogue that takes seriously the obligation of the globe to think about justice at a global scale, to think about race and colonialism as something that we are all implicated in and have a duty to try and make good in the way that Allison suggests. So my congratulations to everyone. It's a fascinating and fabulous dialogue series. I can see that there are people from the US and Canada and all across Africa, Kenyan colleagues and colleagues from all around South Africa joining, and it's a great pleasure to be part of it. You know, I think the image that Allison gave us of doing her work when the protests were coming to their head and the Rhodes and Must Fall statute moment is a reminder of the power of imagery and how much words and understanding their history, but also images matter, and the museums play a critical role in translating ideas into an accessible way that can be rendered in images as well as in writing and in words, and I congratulate them for their important role in that. So Allison talks about decoloniality, and she talks about Ubuntu as a value that is underexplored as a resource for a project of decoloniality. I really think it's valuable to note the words that Allison uses and the distinction she draws between colonization and decolonization and decoloniality. She also talks about pseudo-decoloniality, which I think is deeply important. Her written work, which forms the backdrop to today, emphasizes that South Africa has a double challenge in terms of the decoloniality project, which is overcoming both the original colonial experience and the recolonization through pseudo-decoloniality in 1961 and onwards through apartheid. So I really embrace her rich vocabulary and way of thinking about what the challenge is. Colonialism lives on in its practices and influences. It has a long half-life. And we cannot think about the project of decoloniality as ending with formal sovereignty or a transfer of power or independence, but as a long-haul project for making a constitution speak to Indigenous concerns and processes in ways that are truly responsive to the needs, demands, and voices of the people for whom it is the founding and governing document. So that's decoloniality, and I think Allison beautifully frames what needs to be done and why it matters. Her second claim is that Ubuntu is a value that can do some of the work of helping South Africa achieve its decolonial aims. She notes the complexity of Ubuntu. It can be understood in moderate or radical terms. It has a latent ambiguity to it. I have a 10-year-old son who I am currently homeschooling, who always wants to make things last a long time if it means he doesn't have to write anything down. So he always says to me, Mum, why does that word mean that? Like, where did it come from, and how does language evolve? And we have these long conversations. And Ubuntu is really, the kind of word he has in mind, which is, it has such deep resonance, such long history, and yet it is very hard to define. And one of the questions we've already had, Allison, is wouldn't it be better to codify it? And yet I think part of the power of it is in the suggestion that it does have the capacity to appeal to more moderate understandings and yet to have this more radical potential that you and others are trying to surface. So I want to spend a little bit of time before we open to general questions talking about what it is that would be necessary for a discourse to succeed in achieving decoloniality. And secondly, whether Ubuntu is likely to succeed or fall short. So when we talk about decoloniality, we have both a process and a substantive set of ideals in mind. The process is that the Constitution and the set of legal norms must be owned by the people who it governs, and that norms that were dropped in and given to us by foreign powers and foreign voters and legislators cannot be ours, and that we have to reclaim them in our voice and vote for them through Indigenous national processes of decision making. But there's also a substantive dimension that says that our fundamental norms, our laws, have to speak to our needs. They have to meet our challenges, and they have to be distinctive to our experiences in the same way that our experiences are distinctive compared to the global north or the colonial power, so that they cannot resemble in form the laws of a foreign power that has colonized us, that they need to respond to the distinctive experiences of our own country and our own setting. If there is to be borrowing in this story, it needs to be horizontal, peer-to-peer, global south to global south, learning from others who are like us, not from those who hold the purse strings or have traditionally held geopolitical power. And it's that idea of responding to structural inequality that Allison suggests is the true meaning and true measure of the decolonial project. I think she's absolutely right to think of it in these terms, but to succeed at the level of either discourse, but certainly at the level of substance, I think that any norm that meets these challenges has to be able to do two things. It has to be able to serve as a bridge, a source of change, but also continuity that can take us from the colonial moment to the post-colonial moment in the true decolonial sense. Because we know that colonial government has a long half-life. We don't start afresh, whether we are informally influenced, whether the common law carries over, whether habits, conventions, or norms, investment patterns, social practices, we never write on a clean slate. And there has to be some acknowledgement of that continuity, even as we seek to reconstitute it. So in Etienne Moreinic's language, any norm or discourse that can do the work of decoloniality has to be capable of radical change, but also some degree of continuity and preservation. And secondly, it has to have that distinctive resonance, that distinctive capacity to speak to the substance of the local challenge and circumstances. On those criteria, Ubuntu scores very well. Ubuntu makes sense only if it presupposes some acknowledgement of past wrongdoing. There has been a harm which we must now come together to overcome. We come together in the face of division. We move on in the face of pain. We show forgiveness in the face of her, and that Ubuntu assumes some past which must be then reconstituted or overcome in a way that makes it a true bridging discourse and ideal. It is also one, as Allison suggests, that has deep resonance in Africa and in African consciousness in a way that makes it a peer-to-peer, global south to global south, African to African idea, not one that comes from London or Paris or Brussels, and not one that could come from those countries because it has this distinctive Indigenous meaning and history. So it scores very well on both of those dimensions. So then the question is, are there any ways in which it might fail? Well, Allison points to two. One is that it might be understood in ways that are too moderate rather than radical, and it may be conservatized by courts doing the business of liberal constitutionalism. Of course, we have to have some attention in that context to what the rival discourses might be. And she usefully highlights for us the fact that transformative constitutionalism is the major rival discourse for a post-liberal, post-colonial project in South Africa. My own view is that sometimes Ubuntu might be a stronger discourse, but sometimes transformative constitutionalism might be the stronger, depending on the context and the valence, and that ultimately it is very hard to make general predictions about which of those discourses are most potent and powerful for a project of decoloniality. And we may need both in dialogue with each other for that to be capable of success. So one of the claims that Allison makes is that the understanding of Ubuntu that is to be preferred is the more radical one. And I think it is a project of reinterpretation and resurfacing, which must be carried out in a whole range of settings, but which she sort of suggests, and I think is absolutely right, cannot solely occur within the courts. The courts will conservatize whatever value we give them. And so for Ubuntu to have radical potential, it has to be radicalized first in the public square and then taken to the courts as an instrument of social change. But I still believe that there is an element of Ubuntu that may have built into its logic and experience a sense of forgiveness rather than restitution, a focus on moving forward rather than looking back, in ways that may mean that even with its radical reinterpretations, it is not by itself capable of carrying the weight of social inclusion and economic transformation that Allison wants it to carry. That it may need to be in dialogue with other ideas about equality and transformation in order to do the work of decoloniality that Allison so articulately and powerfully encourages us to aim for. If you look at cases like Makwanyane and the Port Elizabeth occupiers case, you will see the court taking that kind of multi-values-based approach, not trying to see the constitution or the constitutional project in one lens or through one set of values, but rather as a dialogue among values. And one of those is clearly Ubuntu. But to put Ubuntu as the sole candidate for radical change may be to press it too hard into service in ways that may ask too much of it. I think one of the things that is interesting is how and why particular words come to have the significance they do. I would be very interested, because I am sure there are many people on this call who have a significant degree of expertise in language. And one of the things I think it would be very interesting to talk about is whether there would be other words that have a close affiliation with the idea of radical Ubuntu. I've put a word there that is my understanding, it has a Xhosa meaning of reparation rather than the Ubuntu focus on forgiveness. But I do not speak Xhosa, so I want the people who do to tell me what is the word that would be radical Ubuntu, and what would it mean to change words or use Ubuntu in a more radical way. It's clearly an idea that, as Allison says, has the capacity for great richness, harmony, relational freedom, the understanding of moving forward by acknowledging the past, but that it does have a lot of weight placed on it if it is to achieve a project of overcoming all of the race, class, and other injustices that have been left behind by colonialism, doubly amplified in South Africa by the pre and post apartheid experience. I have some other thoughts about the specific cases that I could raise if we have additional time, but for now I'm going to pause and allow our audience to join the conversation and see where those ideas and questions take us.
There was a question from, let me just see. First question, or it was a point raised by Paul, is that Ubuntu is not limited to harmony, reconciliation, or forgiveness. South Africa needs a special codification of Ubuntu into democracy as we have come to understand it. Second one linked to that was raised by Ashwin. Ubuntu is part of the African fabric and essence of community. As such, it traverses generations to include those unseen or unseen, and also future generations. Moreover, it affirms and also confirms personhood and identity.
My point to Paul was that I thought his point was excellent and really well taken, but that ultimately I suspect that codification of Ubuntu deprives it of much of its potential. That part of it is that it is a resonant term for many people, but one that is hard to define precisely and therefore is capable of incremental expansion to new contexts and as serving as a fulcrum for attempts to build agreement in cases of diverse commitments. You know, Cass Sunstein, who's a well-known American legal writer, talks about what he calls incompletely theorized agreements. The idea that we can all agree on something even though we don't agree why, that we all agree it is a good idea for, you know, something to happen. Maybe, you know, it is that, you know, Johannesburg should host the Olympics, but some people see it as about national pride. Some people see it as about encouraging young people to play sport in the country. Some people think it's good for jobs and for infrastructure, and we can all agree without agreeing on the reasons. And that there is something about Ubuntu, which is we don't all agree what it means exactly every time, but we can agree on it in ways that generate consensus around the need for particular outcomes or constitutional changes. And so I think it's a deeply insightful comment, but one that ultimately I think is a mistake to try and codify it because of the degree to which it reduces the capacity for it to unify in circumstances of diversity. There is, Alison, another interesting comment or question, which I might pick up if I may, Geraldine, that's an open question about whether Ubuntu has been damaged. So, you know, Paul says maybe not full codification, but maybe we need a bit of elaboration. Fair enough, Paul, I would agree with that. But there's a big difference between elaboration and codification. And you obviously have a nice beginning at elaboration, which I think is very appealing. But one of the other questions was about whether recent events have in some way undermined the power of Ubuntu. Particularly, I believe that the question was that, you know, that it has been used in contexts where there have been attacks and violence. And I do think we have to, you know, acknowledge that it's very deeply unifying but fragile in its role, and that it could lose its commonality of reference and meaning. But my own view is that elaboration, yes, but codification, no. And in terms of the other interesting point about the future and future generations, I think that's a lovely you know, rendition of what I was trying to get at between the bridge between the past and the future. And if it can do that work, and then of course it can do all sorts of important work in justifying a focus on children's rights, rights to education and access to healthcare, as well as broader changes in regard to climate change and environmental stewardship. But for it to do that, it has to do a lot of work, and it has to be capable of bearing that work. And that's one of the questions I raised is, does radical Ubuntu strain Ubuntu too far? And I think the question is really rhetorical, because the answer is it depends. It depends on the context. And the work done by these kinds of fora to thicken out and strengthen, if not radicalize, the idea itself.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. Alison, did you want to add something to that?
Yes. When I looked at the concept of Ubuntu, I looked at it within the frame of constitutional values and within the legal system of South Africa. And I think in that sense, it has a very, I don't want to say use the word limited. I want to say it has a very specific use as a constitutional value. And here we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that how does it operate as a constitutional value? What do constitutional values do? So I also looked at other values. What do judges do with human dignity? What do they do with values such as equality and so forth? And so we should, in a comparative sense, also ask the question, if we're asking about Ubuntu and its definition and codifying it, if courts use human dignity, if they refer to the value of equality or freedom, do they engage with the conceptual difficulties or differences of those values as well? It seems sometimes as if we're overcritical of Ubuntu and want Ubuntu to do so much, but it also operates as a constitutional value, which means that it should operate in the same way as the other values do. It should, and so the question that I was focused on was how can it operate as a constitutional value? And so I have to admit that in looking at it in that way, I didn't really look too much at the more radical viewpoints because I didn't see it as fitting into the South African transformative or constitutionally transformative project. And so it's only now afterwards that I'm sort of asking that question, but maybe one can actually look at those aspects as well. There was a question or there was a comment, I think it was by, I can't get to it now, but it was about violence in the protests in South Africa. And I think maybe this is a call also to speak about Ubuntu in a way that it relates to our history of race, of inequality, those inequalities that we still see. Perhaps this is a call that we have not been having those very, as what Modiri says, those very uncomfortable, difficult conversations where we have a reckoning with our past, but not to stay in the past, but so as to reimagine a better future. And so I do get the sense that those difficult conversations are not being had. And I think if we look at Ubuntu in that way that Ramose speaks of, that it is about humanity, it is about interconnected, it is about recognizing fellow human beings, but it is also about the struggle for liberation that all Africans and South Africans have. And I don't think we've been looking at it in that way, to be frank. I think we need to look at it in more of an uncomfortable way.
And Alison, there was an interesting addendum to that question, which was, do you think that Ubuntu is more an elitist aspiration and has not permeated to the ordinary South Africans from Wachira? One of the things that I think that the instance of violence and the question really raises is, Ubuntu was always linked to the truth and reconciliation process and aspiration for, moving forward through a mixture of accountability and forgiveness. And, I think that I'm minded to think of the Australian context at the moment where there's a big debate about how First Nations can achieve justice. And the phrase that they've developed is voice, treaty, truth coming last. And when Wachira says, is it elitist? I think if people feel that their fundamental demands for justice haven't been met, to move forward is hard, right? And it may not be that it's elitist so much as an idea, but that many people feel the preconditions for Ubuntu are not present. So that to feel committed to Ubuntu, one has to have a sense of being respected and that one's own economic situation has been addressed and acknowledged, as well as the history of racism. And that without that, it is hard to move forward and to show Ubuntu in the full radical or even more moderate sense. So it may be that it's related not just to that the value doesn't appeal, but more the sense that we believe in it, but where are the conditions that would be necessary for it to apply? And the sense for many young people without jobs or without other basic economic security is that, well, we haven't had the basis for this to be a value that is engaged.
Yeah, I want to add also, you've mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I think for a lot of people, Ubuntu represents the idea of being silenced, I think, because there was a the Azapo case, and also, you know, just after our transition, the idea was embraced that we would be one, and then we sort of forget about the past and grow together. And I think for a lot of people, Ubuntu sort of took up that notion of forgetting the past. And so it's seen as a sense of silencing and forgetting. And I don't think it should. And I think it does have the potential, if we incorporate more of a bit more of a radical understanding, it has the potential of actually not silencing, but actually giving people a voice, and actually shedding light on those type of inequalities that do exist in society. And they're very specific inequalities as well. I mean, it's not just speaking about inequality in general, but, you know, still around the notions of class and race. I think, you know, there's a lot we can say about capitalism. There's probably a conversation on its own as well. But I think it really ties into the potential type of critique that one could have with Ubuntu. So it's really, I think the thing that makes it so fragile as well is that it really has to be used and mitigated and facilitated in a way, in a very progressive way. And the potential for it not to be used in that way is also quite big at the same time. And this is what makes it a really, to use the word fragile, tricky concept. And in South Africa, I think there is also sometimes the idea that we're not on the same page, that we don't have that same idea of what transformation might require.
I think if we talk about Ubuntu in the context of social justice and equality and equity, it is a very radical idea and a difficult conversation to have. I want to go back to Geraldine, because I think there was a question about equality and equity, Geraldine, or any other questions?
From Janine, it's she wanted to know, what do you see the role of the everyday person, particularly the youth, should this goal of transformative power that Ubuntu has to achieve decoloniality, should this goal be achieved as opposed to the elite? And then there was a question that Rosalind already answered, but you might want also to have a go at it. Allison, are the differences between equality and equity being considered in this discussion of Ubuntu? And a last one from Volmarie is, with regards to Wachira's question, do you mean that economic growth is thus necessary for Ubuntu to be practiced in communities, that economic stability is a prerequisite for Ubuntu?
So I want to say about the notion of equality and equity. Within the legal system, those two concepts have very specific meanings. If you're talking about equity in the sense that it comes from the English system, equity, when we talk about discretion that's given to courts to sort of give a more fair decision when a strict application of the law would lead to an unfair result. I do think in some cases, specifically relating to contract, for example, courts might invoke the notion of equity or the notion of Ubuntu as a form of equity in cases where very strict application of the law might lead to an unfair result. The author, I cannot get his first name, but I know that his surname is Becker. He writes about Ubuntu as equity. So I'm not sure if you meant equity in that legal sense or in maybe a different sense. But to my mind, Ubuntu is definitely tied up with the idea of equality as well, and more specifically substantive equality, which is a goal of South Africa. And when we are looking at substantive equality, we are specifically looking at specific structural inequalities in South Africa. So yes, I would say that Ubuntu is related to equality and equity, to answer that question. Yeah, I forgot about the other question that was about, should it just be the courts, and what about communities? And I absolutely agree. I think in South Africa, there's been a lot of emphasis has been placed, or a lot of obligations have been placed on the courts on being responsible for this transformative project. But the courts, it's only one arm of government. There's, two other arms of government. And if we are to really transform our society, then, all arms of government have to be, in the first place, the arms of government. I want to mention that, and we're in a very tricky situation regarding our executive and other arms of state right now, which might also place even more of a burden on courts right now. And then secondly, I do think that these conversations are very important outside of courts, within communities, within universities. It is in fact those types of conversations that were started by these protests that were started at universities, I think, that have really led to a lot of research and work. I mean, if you go and look, if you do a search on Google Scholar, you will see that from 2015 to now, most of research on decoloniality has been a really steep incline on what has been done. And where did it come from? I think it came from the bottom, or from, when I say bottom, I mean community, citizens, students, academia. And so that's why it is very important to have those conversations and to use the value as well within other spheres as well.
There's one last question from Simon. Customary law is recognized in the Constitution as when it applies. How is Ubuntu understood by traditional authorities today?
I think customary law is one of, the difficulties in the South African legal system as well. And it also points to the need for conversation about, really whether we have Africanized or really incorporated enough African perspectives in our legal system. Because there's the idea that we have a hybrid system that's based on common law, customary law, and statutory law. But customary law is still, to a large extent, seen as sort of like the stepchild that we don't really use, but we say that we use it. How Ubuntu is seen by traditional leaders, I cannot specifically comment on that, but I would imagine that it has the type of differences that we spoke about, from going from moderate to more radical viewpoints. I would imagine that there would be these different receptions of it, if I can put it that way.
There's a question, Geraldine, do you have any other question that you want to focus, that you want to bring in? I see there's an interesting question about the distinction that Ramose makes between Ubuntu philosophy and Western philosophy.
I mean, I think it's very interesting sort of question, and my initial response to Norma was that I think that one way of reading Ramos is that he is arguing for radical Ubuntu in the sense of a rejection of a more liberal and moderate understanding. But Norma suggests that possibly it goes further and is a kind of radical anti-generalization in favor of the particular. I'm not sure, Norma, that I would think that what I would call contextualism is, post-Western or non-Western, and that generalizations and broad principles are Western. Obviously, the sort of classical liberal thought that one might be thinking of when one talks about Western has that, but there's also a very rich school of thought coming out of North America and Europe in the last 50 years, which really takes context and power seriously. So it's a complicated question because one's asking to really imagine what they would think of Western thought. Is that true, if it's useful? But I do think that your question draws attention to one of the virtues of Ubuntu, which is it is a standard or understanding or norm that is attentive to particulars, that it doesn't have some generalized account. It has a sort of guiding philosophy, but that has to be attentive to particulars, and that's a strength. And if that's a strength that one thinks Western philosophy can't accommodate, well, then that's a weakness of Western philosophy. I just tend to think that there are thinkers that are more particularistic and context sensitive than that account might suggest.
I also think that what I want to add is there's this juxtaposition between Western philosophy and African philosophy. And the critique that one can give, at least the older forms of Western philosophy, there was this sense of universalizing. We know this is what human rights should look like, and this is what liberty and freedom and everything should look like. But I also want to mention that I think we should, also admit that there are different schools of African philosophy as well. And then I do get the idea that sometimes there's this idea of this is African philosophy, but there are different types, there are different schools even within African philosophy. There are more moderate and more radical viewpoints even within the African philosophy, and a long tradition of that as well. So yeah, I think that is something that one should also incorporate.
But Norma's corrected me and said it's not particularism, it's a sense of multiple realities, and that might be something deeper by way of challenge. But as she suggested, that's going perhaps into a debate that's very rich, but maybe getting beyond the scope of this discussion.
We have about 3 minutes left, and I know everybody have things to do, and so I really want to thank you, the two of you. I do wish we could have a conversation about the Ukulungiswa. I think that would have been interesting, but maybe we would have more time and more opportunities for more. For talking more about this. And I want to thank you, Allison, for the investment in this work. I think it really is important work, and we are just starting the conversation or continuing an important conversation. And Rosalind, also, I can't thank you enough for your generosity and for your time and staying up late for our part. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who signed up to take part in this webinar. We would be keen for you to let us know what you've learned, what we could do to improve these events. And then I also want to thank those indispensable individuals who always do the work behind the scenes at Stellenbosch University, Bongani, Mgijima, Geraldine Frieslar, who helped with the chat file and the Q&A session. And then the ultimate Alvan Galant, our IT manager and the co-host of the session, and Natasha Coltman, who is our superwoman administrator. I also want to thank our colleagues at MSU who were so incredibly supportive to show us the Zoom ropes. Thank you, Nicole McKenzie, Benzadesta, for your time. The next webinar is on 31 August. Seminar fellow Dr. Motamai Molefe will be in conversation with Professor Nontobeko Moyo from Indiana State University at South Bend, USA, on the topic Ubuntu, Human Dignity and a Decent Society. Details, registration links to this event and more information about the events for the rest of the year are on the website. If you have agreed to it, we will use your registration to this webinar to stay in touch. Greetings from us. Stay healthy wherever you are and be kind to one another. I want to ask the panelists to stay behind for a few minutes, but for everyone else, goodbye and thank you.